Welcome to Powerhouse with Coach Maker, your weekly engagement into the heart of the nation's political and economic pulsation. Live every Tuesday at 7 p.m. on SSBC television. This is Powerhouse, where realization meets empowerment, just on SSBC television.
And tonight we address a very critical issue in South Sudan, that is flooding. Countless lives have been lost, homes destroyed, communities displaced. However, we are privileged to have Deng Chol, a distinguished researcher from the Abdul Latif Water and Food System Laboratory at MIT, Master of MBA from George Washington University, MPA from Harvard University, and Bachelor of Science in Political Science and Economic from Arizona, to provide understanding on flood risk management and mitigation strategies. Deng's expertise in social eco-hydrology and climate dynamics is instrumental in developing a sustainable development plan for South Sudan. His goal is to mitigate flood risk, promote economic growth, and protect the valuable ecosystem of the Sat wetlands. In fact, he recently took a proactive action by conducting a comprehensive scientific research and environmental studies on the Sat wetlands for the very first time since the country's had independence in 2011. Join us as we explore solutions to safeguard lives, livelihoods, and the future of South Sudan. So we're going to welcome Deng. So welcome to South Sudan and welcome to SSBC.
Thank you very much, and great to be here in South Sudan.
All right, for the few days you've been in the country, how has it been? How, especially with this extreme heat in South Sudan?
Yes, it has been quite an interesting time for me. I traveled from the UK. At that time, it was 2 degrees Celsius, and I flew in here and found that it was 41. So there was a shock in my body system, no doubt. But since I was born and grew up here, and this is my home, 2 weeks later or so, I got used to it. And
all right, I hope the research went well. Welcome to our program, SSBC Powerhouse.
Thank you very much. The site did go really well.
All right.
Indeed.
What dear viewer of SSBC, before we proceed with our interview, let's take a look at some of his research footage that he has conducted at the state level from different states.
This is Powerhouse, where realization meets empowerment, just on SSBC television.
A doctorate candidate at Oxford University's School of Geography and Environmental Studies, Deng Chol took a proactive action by conducting the comprehensive scientific research on floods-affected states and Sat wetlands. Sat wetlands is an environmental and economic asset that support livelihoods, national economy, and ecosystem services, including climate change risk and also hydrological functions in the Nile Basin's areas of South Sudan. The pressing need for rigorous scientific studies and environmental experts emphasize the imperative for in-depth research into the floods-affected states and Sat communities among the populace. Deng explained the primary objectives for these field studies is to formulate a sustainable development plan to the unique challenges faced by the country. Since attaining independence in July 2011, South Sudan has regrettably and neglected to conduct comprehensive scientific research into the dynamics of the floods and Sat wetlands for the magnitudes of human suffering in times of catastrophe.
This is Powerhouse, where realization meets empowerment, just on SSBC television.
Welcome back after that short break where we have seen some of the work that Deng has been doing since he came to South Sudan. Like I mentioned, he's a researcher who is doing his PhD, and the flooding in South Sudan is part of his studies research. So you are conducting field studies throughout South Sudan. Why and how did you select the field states, or the field site rather?
Yeah, thank you very much, Anna Kuch, for having me. The question of why is very important, and I think it goes directly to the main objective of this study. And the question of why is a realization that the communities and the populations, especially in the South regions, are actually in a bind. On one hand, they want to live with water because their livelihoods derive from the local environment that depend on the water resources, including seasonal regeneration of soil moisture, grasslands for their cattle, farming, for example, the nutrients that come with seasonal flooding. But on the other hand, their adaptive capacity is so limited that in the face of extreme flooding, characterized by increased intensity and frequency of flooding, they are no longer able to survive and even leave alone to be resilient. And so these binds has created, in my mind, a serious vision. And that vision is to say we ought to be able to have a sustainable solution that will, on one hand, ensure that the water resources around these communities and population of more than half of the country, 6 million people live in this region, that they can live with water, depend on the water resources, but at the same time they are on dry land, that they are not flooded, that their livelihood is not uprooted. So that is the question of why.
So briefly mention a few sites that you have visited that are within the narration you've just given us.
Indeed, indeed. And so I have been, the first place I went to was Unity State. And the delineation of the area, really, or the field study, was based on a number of factors, including the results of my geospatial analysis of flood mapping and population exposure to flooding. In that hydrological modeling, Unity State is number one in terms of the extent of the flood, as well as the communities and population exposed to flooding. Then followed by Upper Nile. I have also been to Upper Nile. I have been to Malakal, to Panyika, in a place called Tunja. And also within Unity, I have been to Bentiu, part of Mayom County. I have also been to Mayendit and a place called Mangaport. The other state is Werap. I have also been fortunate to travel to Werap. Throughout Gogrial West, Gogrial East, and also Toi North to a place called Akop, Payam. I have also been to Tuch County. In respect to Lake State, I was fortunate enough to have a plane given to me by Samaritan Pairs, an NGOs that is partnering with our team in Oxford. And we were flying with some of your crew members. We were fortunate that we had a cameraman and a reporter from SSBC. So we actually flew 4,000 feet above the ground. And that allowed us from Mangalaya all the way to Mayendit to document the extent of the site. And so part of the consideration of the criteria were the result of geospatial analysis of the plot modeling. And there were other factors that were considered.
Okay, based on your recent scientific research on the Sat wetlands, how would the drying up of the Nile River impact South Sudan stability, particularly in terms of water access, agriculture, and livelihoods?
Yeah, yeah. This is the questions, and it is the questions because the drying up of the Sat, either by natural phenomena or by anthropogenic activities, meaning human cause it, directly translate to desertification of that whole area, and that means it is environmental genocide. Environmental genocide is where a change in the environment is so severe that the ecosystem of the whole area, and when we talk of ecosystem, human beings is one of them, number one. We have wildlife that move back and forth during the season of flooding. You have animals like cattle, sheep, goats that depend on grassland. Then you have farming. And also you have all the other species within the water, including fish. All of these has created an ecosystem that depend on each other. And there is a food web within this ecosystem. And when that is gone, it is environmental genocide, not only to humans who live there and who depend on the fresh water, but also on the wildlife. Either they can migrate away from this area because there's no longer fresh water, no longer grassland, or they can perish. What about all the species within this area if it dried up? Again, those one can perish or migrate somewhere. And then what happened to the grassland? Lack of grassland translate to the disappearance of cattle. And if cattle are gone, farming is decimated, then what do you think? Human beings would either migrate or perish. And so the drying up of the sun really translates to what I term as environmental genocide.
Okay, talking of environment, can you clarify the distinction between environmental impact assessment and strategic environment assessment, and how each informs flood policy and management decisions?
They are very much the same in the sense that you look at the environmental impacts of a given project. But the difference between environmental impact assessment without the word is strategic is simply looking at a project that has already been implemented, or a plan or a policy that has already taken off. You are now looking at its impact on the environment. In this case, you are looking at its impacts on the water cycle, on the water movement. You are looking at its impacts, for example, on the forest, on the trees that are being planted. You are looking at whether there is a pollution that can happen to the environment. You are looking at the impacts out of such project as it relate to fish or any other water resources, as it relate to livestock, farming, let's say the community around it. Whereas the word is strategic, relate to a particular distinction within this project or plan. And that is that an intervention is envisioned or conceived by the government, either national government or the state government, and that it is a government project, is sponsored by the government, and that the government need to be strategic in how that project, since the government own it, and which means the accountability and responsibility of such project falls back on the government. Now the government need to be strategic enough in how it carry out the environmental, social, and impact assessment in that context. So that is a basic distinction. How it relates to flood management, it means that if the government is strategic in that environmental impact assessment, it must factor in issues such as floodplain, issues that can come down the stream of the river. Because sometimes you can come with a wonderful intervention, but if you lost foresight of the impact it could bring, including inadvertently creating consequences of that. For example, you come up with a major physical intervention. You want perhaps to dig a big canal. You want to be able to envision what impact would that have down the stream of the community.
Regarding your research objectives, could you elaborate on how extreme flooding events affect migration patterns within the SAT region and its socio-economic implication?
Yeah, sure. And actually this goes to the heart of my research, especially the field study that I have just concluded. I am looking at how migration patterns have changed in response not to seasonal flooding, because that water cycle and the water balance in respect to seasonal flooding has already been established. But my research contribution in terms of scientific inquiry is actually the impacts of extreme flooding. And what I have found out in places that I have traveled is that pastoralists, these people who move with their cattle, their patterns and migration routes have changed in response to extreme flooding. In some places, during seasonal flooding, they would be going let's say, southwest for a certain period of time, 1 month or 2 months. But then now, when the summer is about to kick in, January, they would cross over to where the sat permanent area, where they would be closer to the water, and that migration pattern is established. But with extreme flooding, it's actually the opposite, because the area which is where Toch is the word that is used by the Chuluk, the Dinka, and the Nuer, who are predominantly in this swarm area. And so when it is extreme flooding, like what we saw in 2019 to 2022, these pastoralists actually move to the opposite side, away from the permanent. And they have to create a new migration routes, a new migration pattern, learning about high grounds. And these migration have actually crossed over beyond the county borders, beyond the state, and even beyond, if you will, South Sudan boundary, because they have been displaced and they're looking for high ground. In respect to the community migration now, where we have women, elderly men, and children included in the events of extreme flooding, the entire population have been abruptly removed. And all they have to do, they are in emergency mood. So they just have to go to their neighbors. They have to learn where to go to. Like, for example, in United States, they are now in Werrap. They are being, population is in Twitch County in Werrap. Some of them went as far as a BA. So in this situation, the entire community moved. And the migration pattern has changed historically. And when I was talking with these communities, they would mention 3 or 4 major flooding that happened in that location, and how migration has changed from one flooding phenomenon to another phenomenon.
Dear viewer of SSBC, we are taking our first short break. Stay with us. We have more discussion coming up after this short break.
Welcome to Powerhouse with the Kuch Maker, your weekly engagement into the heart of the nation's political and economic pulsation. Live every Tuesday at 7 p.m. on SSBC television. This is Powerhouse, where realization meets empowerment, just on SSBC television.
Hello dear viewer of SSBC, welcome back after that short break. Like I mentioned earlier during my introduction, that we are addressing a critical issue affecting South Sudan, and that is flood. So we have expert here who is also a student at Oxford University doing a scientific research in South Sudan about the flooding and other environmental issues that are affecting South Sudan. So what are the results and findings from your hydrological modeling of South Sudan's flood?
Yes, on the quantitative part of the research, we use science. It is clear that South Sudan as a whole will continue to experience flooding in years to come. And this is not isolated. South Sudan is part of the global community. It's part of the global climate change and global warming. And temperatures are rising. They have been rising since the industrial period in 1970s. And we also have seen heat wave recently. And so the the opposite side of this weather phenomenon will continue to exist in South Sudan. And so in respect to flooding, the modeling has shown clearly that a state like Unity State, Upper Nile, Werrap, and Jonglei, especially the 4 of them, will continue to experience exceeding flooding. In the event that we have what we call the 100-year return period, which is a designation of an extreme flooding event. What happened in 2019 could be maybe a 50-year return period, a flood that comes back every 50 years. But it does not mean it waits for 50 years, because the frequency has actually become more frequent, so to speak. And so, on the other hand, my field study, traveling across the country, have shown many other findings. And many other findings is that communities and population love to live with water because their life depends on water resources. But at the same time, they want a solution, a sustainable solution. I have also learned about the wisdom, what I call the indigenous wisdom of our native people, because they have derived this knowledge from their experience with flooding over many years. And they have the lived story. This lived story is part and parcel of the contribution to the solution that we need to have. And so my approach has been to engage multiple stakeholders. And number one of the stakeholders are communities and population who have lived in this flooding. And their wisdom has been tremendous, including knowing whether they will have drought or they will have flooding. There are signs that they have seen. They listen to the whistle of the birds. They feel the air. They also see the nature, including ants. When the ants is building, ant hills for a while, it indicates to them that there will be flooding that year. So there is a wisdom to be learned from this community. But there is also other finding that human health and human security is actually central to what we are talking about. And especially women have been uniquely affected by flooding, both directly in terms of their own health, as well as indirectly when it comes to responsibility in the house. Diseases also have affected cattle in most places, including when the water recedes, there is these snails that the water leaves behind. And when the cattle graze and actually eat this snail, they die instantly. And this is also another health hazard. I have also found out with the community displaced abruptly, they tend to be in a very concentrated area. For example, in Malakal, they are in IDPs. In Unity, especially Bentiu, they are in 2 IDPs. Here in Mangala, we have IDPs. And when you travel and see with your eyes the level of suffering people are and the concentration, what you fear in this environment is that there is open latrines, there are open defecation, and all the latrines are submerged underwater. Some of the water get as far as deeper than my height, 2 feet, 3 feet. And with water in that setting, my goodness, what you fear is waterborne diseases, a potential outbreak of a widespread of waterborne diseases with that concentration and the carrying capacity of that little location. For example, the IDPs, 2 of them in Binti, one carries about 100,000 people. And this used to be POC and now IDPs. Then the other population is about 40 that were displaced, 40,000 that were displaced by flooding.
Now with all this situation you have explained, and you are seeing some of the states will continue to have flooding in their states. So what is the policymakers doing to eradicate or actually to solve the issues affecting them? Or what do you think as individuals should be the solution, permanent solution?
Yeah, I attended the water sector workshop here shortly upon my arrival on the 19th of February this month. And they were talking about WATCH program, which is talking about water hygiene and sanitation. So I have seen what they are doing there. But what they are doing in terms of resiliency of the communities to flooding is yet to be seen. But what I will propose to be done is that we need to approach the issue of flooding at the level of basin-wide scale, where we look at the Bahar Kazal Basin, we look at the Sobat, let's say the Baro, Sobat, the Koba Basin, and the Bahar Jaban, the Sad Basin. All of these are one, because they are interconnected hydrologically, especially during the extreme flooding. They are one. And sometimes they appear to be disconnected, especially when the extreme, during the period where we have little water from the equatorial lake and maybe little vertical water from the rain. But generally they are connected, and our approach is to understand the slope and understand the gradient from all of these places. For example, in the case of Lagos State, Werrap, and Unity State, when I was there, I discovered that Bentiu is a hole, is a depression. the northern part of Bentiu, which is Ruweng administrative area, and part of Mayom County is slightly raised. The southern part, Lair and Mayendit, and part of Lake State is slightly raised. And here you have a depression. And so what happened with this depression is that it requires an understanding of the upstream, Bahar Kazal river system as a whole. Because the problem of this whole, the water did not fall vertically from the rain. This water came through the river inflow. And even that, the problem lies in the source. Maybe because of what we call geomorphological processes. Geomorphological processes where erosion happens, channels disappear because of siltation, and new channels are created because water flow and is spread out. Part of that can contribute to the flooding. And so the problem of flooding in a depression, like Unity State, for example, is not necessarily, cannot necessarily be understood in that isolation. For example, I would say, for example, on the slope coming from the northern part, you put a reservoir here, and that reservoir is, you have to accomplish many purposes with it, multi-purposes. Controlling the flooding, when you put it there, ensure that the study has indicated what capacity it will hold in terms of volume of water. The communities around it, if they are cattle keepers, make sure this is also providing water for cattle keepers. So you will now control the flooding, but then you create a small minor channel, like a little canal, that take only excess water toward Baharanam, northward. The same thing to the southern part, the slope, create a similar reservoir so that the water does not get to the hull. And what I have found out, Anna Kuchi, is that these communities and population that settled early on, they settled as communities. They were not settling as urban center. They were not settling as towns or cities. So when South Sudan became autonomous in 2005 and subsequently independent in 2011, they would have sat down and redesigned cities and actually do urban planning. And some of these places should not have been really suitable for cities or towns because initially these populations settled with their cattle just to be as close as possible to the water. They were not meant to be cities or major towns. And instead, they have become towns now, and they are deep in the floodplain.
Considering this disproportionate impact on rural communities, what strategic should be developed to address the effect of flooding on this population? You have talked on the proposed, but what strategies should the government develop at least to work on this population?
Number one, early warning sign, because these populations are lying in darkness, and this is in the 21st century. They should have access to know that next year there will be flooding, even flooding of this magnitude. Next year there will be drought, even drought of this magnitude. This would allow them to prepare for the worst. That's number one. Number two, they need to be provided with investment in terms of what I call climate finance. Identify these communities that are more vulnerable and invest in them in terms of climate finance. That will allow them to perhaps elevate their area, relocate to higher ground with the support in terms of settlement. Also climate resilience crops that need to plant it, for example. Also, as you know, Anakuch, we have only 2 seasons. We have dry season and wet season. Maybe in equatorial region, we may have a longer rainy season, but in the Upper Nile, the Bahar Kazal region, all the way northwest, we have a long dry season. Dry season starts in November, all the way to around May. That is like 7 to 8 months. And this dry season, the community have no water. Perhaps the government now and other stakeholders like NGOs and other practitioners come up with water reservoir. Say that this water reservoir will sustain the community during this 7 to 8 dry season. They can actually cultivate during the dry season. And the worst part of these kinds of flooding that I have gathered during my traveling across the country is that the rain patterns have become erratic. They are no longer coming as usual. So sometimes rain does not come in April, does not come in May, and then people are waiting to plant. But when the rain comes, let's say in June or late May, it pours. And now it is not conducive for planting. And then next you see, we are in November and it is a dry season. Maybe there need to be a shift in our thinking.
Okay.
That cultivation may need to happen during the dry season because it is the longer. But then we need to have water closer to the community to use for irrigation during the dry season, which is the longest, for example.
Okay, in that case, how has the displacement of communities due to rising waters in South Sudan contributed to food insecurity? And what measures can be taken to address this, considering before people were not doing farming, but a few who were doing this? So how has their displacement contributed to food insecurity?
No, absolutely. I mean, this is it. We are talking of food security. And we are, these IDPs, people that I was telling you, right from Mangala, not too far from where we are, in Unity, in Upper Nile, in Werap. These are depending on the UN system.
Yes.
And the UN system, in the mind of others, they perceive it as if it is a cow that you can milk forever. Okay? That can have its milk flowing. No. We have seen the war around the world. And with the war in Ukraine, the war in Iraq, and all these disasters across the country, the UN is running out of liquid. And their attention is turned somewhere else. And our people are suffering. Though we have to have a mindset shifting from what we call humanitarian emergency to developmental plan. That need to be something the government champion. And that need to be communicated well to our partners. Our partners, international NGOs, national NGOs, so that there is that shift. And to begin to help the population move to a dry land, the country is huge. When I was in Upper Nile and traveled on a speedboat through the South Nile, you feel like you are in another country. There was a time I didn't even think we are landlocked, because when I saw the extent of the South, I couldn't. It was beyond my eye distance. And then I was in Werab traveling across Gorial East, Gorial West, Toy North, and you again felt like you are in another country. And we took a plane to document this South extent all the way to Miami. Again, we have a huge country. We can host, if with our population multiplied today from 12 million to 100 million, we will still have plenty of place to live. So this idea of having people in one flat plain should not work. Let's move people to a dry land and let us not settle them as if they are in refugees camp in their own country. Give them plenty of land so that they cultivate. Plenty of land so that they are supported in their housing and so forth. So the food security is huge and famine is more likely to happen.
But come to think of it, if they're given plenty of land, maybe in different states, let's say someone maybe now from Jonglei is relocated to Unity State, the host community might not allow that, considering that it is their state. So you will become a displaced person. So if you suggest that the government should allocate land, especially to these dry areas, how will that be, especially to the citizen?
Indeed, that's a good question, because I am aware of some of the tensions between the host community and IDPs in some places, for example. And so in this case, there are 3 steps for it. Let's say in the case of Jonglei, as you brought the example, Jonglei as a state has now run out of dry land. So the migration that the relocation that I'm talking about, first and foremost, need to happen within Jonglei. Jonglei, the eastern part of Jonglei, is slightly higher. And actually, initially, these were places, these communities were initially. But because of other factors, perhaps insecurity, they abandoned those areas and they came closer, and they are settling very close to the let's say the coastline of the Nile South. If they migrate back to where they is, there is plenty of land. In the event that they cannot do that because of other factors, and now they are in another state in Central Equatoria, this is where collaboration is very important. The host community and the IDP need to understand that they are one people. They are citizens of one country, they are citizens of one land, and that they need to cooperate. The IDP's people need to be responsible and accountable if they have cattle. If they are coming to coexist, they have to abide by the local rules and the local norms of those people. At the same time, the government at a national level, including the legislature, the executive, for example, and even the judiciary, because the constitution lies in judiciary, and the definition of lands is within the constitutional framework. All of these need to come together because these are one people. And you should not feel like refugees in your country. But at the same time, if the host community have concern caused by the IDP, it is imperative that this is resolved. Also, if you are going to invest in the IDP's community, either through the UN agency or through the government, don't neglect the host community, invest in both communities. If you are going to have, and the UNHCR is very good with this in Uganda, let's say you are going to dig boreholes or wells among the IDP, maybe 10 of them. Also dig boreholes and water well, 7 in the host community. If you are going to build a school among the IDPs, also build a school among the host community so that both of them see each other as equal and that they are treated as equal citizens. And they will realize eventually that their being in one place is actually advantageous to them. They will have business among themselves, they will trade among themselves, and you will realize that we actually do need one another. But I think it is also important for people of Jonglei and other places like Unity that have migrated to Werrap to realize that the state also have high ground and that they need to be able to go back and resettle and try to find a way to go to a higher ground in their states.
We are taking another short break. Like I said, we are in here with Deng Majok Chol, who is doing his research, especially in a comprehensive scientific research and environmental studies on the Sat wetlands for the first time.
Welcome to Powerhouse with Coach Maker, your weekly engagement into the heart of the nation's political and economic pulsation. Live every Tuesday at 7 p.m. on SSBC television. This is Powerhouse, where realization meets empowerment, just on SSBC television.
Hello dear viewer, welcome back after that short break. Today has been a very interactive day where we are talking about the most critical issue that is affecting South Sudan, and that is flooding. We have seen most of our states are affected by flooding, and we have an expert today who is giving us way forwards, what should be done, how people should cope with flooding. So just to proceed with your research, what are the striking initial observations about your field-based research that you have conducted so far?
Yes, I have been amazed by the generosity and the resiliency of our people in the face of adversity, in this case natural adversity. As much as they are suffering, they continue to exhibit dignity. And speaking of dignity, that is another point that strikes me. You know, when people are displaced abruptly, every person in a household has a responsibility and certain role. So in a household, a man has a role, especially in traditional setting, and you know, a wife has a role, or a mother has a role. In the case of these people who keep cattle, the role of a man is to have cattle and to look for cattle, and also to do farming along with his wife. In this instance, what has struck me is that with men having cattle gone and they find themselves in IDP's camp, they feel that their own dignity is really compromised. And there is a way I was able to tell when their dignity is hurt, even though the whole inside themselves are not expressing it. This has turned to a very fragile situation in marriages and in household. Even some of these men, because of this trauma and the feeling that their own responsibility is no longer the case, and they are in these places, they tend to get angry quickly, and there are cases of violence at home against their wives and against family. And it goes back to the impact of flooding. What also strikes me is the wisdom of our people. There is something to be learned from them. And this is what my research is trying to bring out, that we cannot just come with scientific research and say, here is a solution. And these people are the one who knows better. They have the native knowledge. They have what it takes to communicate to the rest of the world what this will look like. And in fact, in the past, they were able, the natural system and the human system were able to coexist and co-evolve and even co-thrive together. The only tipping point that we are experiencing now is that in the South region, what strikes me is that I have come up with 5 climatic scenario, but I can cheer 2 of them extreme. On the extreme end, there is catastrophic flooding that could happen, and that would mean maybe 50% of the entire country is submerged underwater. Expansive flooding and human life is difficult, existential threat. That is one scenario. In this scenario, maybe 7 out of 10 states is submerged. Then there is an opposite scenario. Opposite scenario is that we have little water. We actually instead prolonged drought. And with this prolonged drought, they start shrink. And when it shrinks, we are dealing with water stress. And this water stress is existential threat. And in the middle are situations that can be managed. And so this scenario, when I was traveling, tend to be the case. It's also important to emphasize that with the communities now, in these concentrating the health factor, as we talked earlier, there are potential for outbreak of serious health. And it is important for Ministry of Health at the national level, state level, to be able to be proactive ahead of time. Assess from the health vantage point how these places are in terms of latrine, in terms of toilet, in terms of human being, children, and so forth. What is also striking me is that these IDPs have been there for a while now. And children were born there. And these children who are born there are now growing. Some of these IDPs were as a result of war. And a child who was born in 2013 is how old now? 11 years. And I heard a story where that child went out to visit the bigger villages. And that child was shocked to learn that his or her own setting was very different from what she visited. And she said, in our town, she called the IDPs camp town. In our town, we are very close at one another. Buildings are so close to one another, and actually we live together. But in your towns here, she was now talking about the village, your way is spread out. Yeah. So this experience is like as if this is another country. So there are a lot of striking points that I have found out with our people, but the suffering of our women in the midst of flooding is striking. And the uniqueness of the impacts of flooding on women is something that need to be looked at closely.
All right, given the current extreme heat wave we are facing as a country now, what implication does this have for flood risk management and resilience efforts in South Sudan?
Yeah, it is important to note also that heat wave has also been a result of human activities, just like we are dealing with flooding. And so extreme heat is happening in most places. And it is important to understand while we are addressing flooding, it is also important not to lose sight of drought and the heat wave as a result of drought. And these human activities that have contributed to heat wave will continue to multiply these human activities, what they call anthropogenic climate change. And therefore, in our planning, it is important to come up with flood risk mitigation, either in terms of education, awareness, physical intervention, in terms of water reservoir, dams, and what have you, managing that flooding. It's also important to say, how do we manage the impacts of heat wave? For example, when I came here in Japan on the 19th of February, it was really hot. I myself almost dehydrated when I was in Werap. And so, and I felt the heat, no doubt about it. So it is important in our planning, especially with the schools, where we have young children. And these schools also need to have feeding. I mean, these public schools need to have nutritional feeding. Children go to school hungry in the morning because there's nothing at home. And if they are exposed to heat wave in those places, for example, and they don't have enough water in their body and not enough energy in their body, what do you think will happen to these children in school? It will affect their learning. And this is not only limited to children, also elderly people across the country. It is also important that this is factored in the Ministry of Health, and that the government as a whole have what we call the whole of the government approach in addressing these issues. So these are actually two sides of the same coin. The heat wave, which is a derivative or effects of prolonged drought and human activities, and then the drought. Both of them need to be part and parcel of our sustainable management.
All right, we are winding up. Could you elaborate on the specific impact of both droughts and floods on various aspects of life in South Sudan? That is including agriculture, infrastructure, and public health. Just to mention a few, because you have covered the health sector before.
Right.
In terms of infrastructure and agriculture,
yes.
What can you say about that?
Right. In terms of agriculture, we are fortunate in the rapid runoff region, Western Equatoria, part of Central Equatoria, part of Western Bahr Ghazal. You know, we cultivate like sometime twice a year. But in the Upper Nile region as a whole and most of Bahr Ghazal region, it's only once in a year. And so when the flooding comes like that, it decimates, it destroys the whole productivity, the whole farming. And to your point earlier, that what quickly lead to food insecurity. So when farming is gone, what else do you expect? People vulnerability and food insecurity and human security. And actually, if the government consider this as part of national security, if they look at water resources issues and all of this dynamic as part of national security, they should be able to prioritize. The other issue is livelihood system. Livelihood system that include cattle keeping, that include fishing, that include hunting for the wildlife. For example, if it is approved, not illegal hunting. All of these are part of the ecosystem. When flooding comes and all of this is submerged, these are uprooted and the ecosystem is disrupted, for example. The wisdom of our people, when I was in Akop County, there was one question that I asked. I said, you, the people of Akop County, if I ask you, especially this generation, 60 years and above, and there were women and men, what local name would you give to this major flooding so that it goes in history in your native? And they gave me three things. They said, we will call this flood as the flood of Sermon. Sermon is that big fish. And the reason they say that the flood was so high, and the Sermon usually stay in the deep part of the water, but that flooding, the Sermon would come all the way to the home, next to the door. Then they said we would call it the flood of monkey. The flood of monkey, meaning the big fish, there is that big fish, I think it's called the mudfish. In Dinka it's called a take. This fish was brought, was very big. When they dissect it, they find a little, a baby monkey inside the fish. So they call it the flood of monkey. And the analogy from an elderly wise man was that because it was flooded everywhere, the monkey had to give birth up on top of the tree. And the baby fell down into the flood. Then the big fish got the baby monkey. And because we are talking of food wave, human being came, got the fish, and quickly take it and dissect it. And that's how the monkey, they call it the flood of monkey. Then the other name was that they call it in a local name called Riam. Riam is that it is something that comes with a titanic force that is sweeping everything, the building, the tree, the vegetation, human being, and anything. That is so sweeping. That is the name they give. When I asked the people in Bentiu what name they would give, the Nuer people in Bentiu, they say it will be called Bab. Bab is a Nuer name. We translate. It's also a similar name in Dinka and maybe in the other Nilotic group. Bab, meaning it's all is also come, and Bab meaning and sweep everything else. So that is a local name given by this flooding during my fieldwork.
All right. In just 30 minutes, is there any message that you can tell to your university and those who have supported you during this time of your research? Just 30 seconds.
Yeah, thank you so much. I truly appreciate the support of the presidency as a whole, including the office of the president, as well as office of vice president, and also South Sudan People Defense Force for ensuring that my trip I was secure enough. Local partners, including Samaritan Pairs, also local support, my family, as well as my colleagues who have been supporting me throughout this research. I also appreciate the support of SSBC for airing this out and coming to Mayendit. Support by partners like the Dutch, the Netherlands embassy, the Norwegian embassy, some of the UN hub, especially UNHCR that has been accommodating me in the UN hub in Malakal and also in Bentiu and other places. Citizens who have come to me and encouraged me to continue to do this, and more importantly, the victim of flood that continue to show tremendous resiliency and tremendous dignity. They would share with me whatever food they have, the dignity that they have shown, and I hope this conversation continue to engage all the stakeholders, the government, NGOs, the UN, the local community, the media community, because then we can be able to implement the solution afterwards.
Dear viewer of SSBC, we have come to an end of our interview where we were talking about the flooding in South Sudan, and as I mentioned earlier, Deng came here purposely for the research that is conducting, since he's a student at Oxford University doing his PhD and in final stages. So he has conducted a scientific research and environmental studies on the Sat wetlands for the very first time, like I mentioned earlier. So he has traveled to all the states, and all the footage he has mentioned before, he was able to educate you people on way forwards, how you can also manage the flooding and how people can cope with it. That's all we have for you. We are done for now. On behalf of the team, I am Akuch Maker. Don't forget to tune in to SSBC Powerhouse with Akuch Maker every Tuesday at 7 p.m. Bye-bye for now.
Welcome to Powerhouse with Akuch Maker, your weekly engagement into the heart of the nation's political and economic pulsation. Live every Tuesday at 7 p.m. on SSBC television. This is Powerhouse, where realization meets empowerment, just on SSBC television.